Okay, so it's time to start putting things back together, and in order to do that we will need to heat up the case, and then essentially intermediate and the output shaft, they go in together. You can actually do it one at a time, but it requires some of the wiggling, so that's why I'll probably do it in the same time, both of these. Later input shaft easily slides in. So before I put case in oven to heat it, I'm going to install the oil channel, and the fabric washer that was here on this screw is unfortunately non-existent anymore, so I'm going to use the one that came with the kit, and I believe it's aluminum made. Well, it's actually steel washer. Okay, hope it will still be good. Now we are going to just put the channel back. That looks good. And now what we need to do is basically heat up the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, leave like 5 to 10 minutes case in, and then we'll come back and start putting shafts. Okay, so case is freshly baked. First oil bubbles go inside. Don't forget those. Okay, and now let's try to slide everything in. Okay. There it is, fully seated. Now we are going to wait till it cools down, and then basically we can proceed with the remaining part installation and shimming. Okay, now when it cooled down we can proceed with installing another shifting forks. One. Here's another. And we can also put a tiny bit of MOS grease, just light coating. Okay, that should be enough. Perfect. Right, now we can do input shaft. it is. This is why I usually wait till it cools down, because it's much easier to align forks onto a cams of a shifting mechanism when it cools down than actually when the case is hot. Okay. Let's give it a try. $30mm socket. Okay. Let's turn it over to see that everything is still in. Okay. This. That's terrific. Now we can actually tighten these screws. Okay. That's it. Okay, now we can put this pivoting bushing in. I'm just going to lube it a bit or grease it. Just like that. In. Can also put new sealing. Okay, so we can proceed with reshimming this transmission. I just want to mention that for these transmissions it's very important shimming and how you set the end plate, because that can mean a lot of difference once when you assemble everything and bike is running. In order to properly shim this transmission, you will need something like this, like a completely flat surface that you will measure protrusion of this of these three bearings over the edge of the case. This one is from Cycle Gear, but I guess you can find other brands outside as well that you can use, but this one works really nice for me. Okay, so in order to do that, to do shimming, first we want to measure it with the gasket. So you lay gasket down and then you essentially put this flat plate on top, and now there are 4 screws that go in, and you will need to, for this plate we will need to use longer screws that usually cover is attached to the case. And I'm using old wave washers with this, and now we will torque everything to spec, and that's 72 inch-pound. So to do the shimming, we will need to use some of the precision instruments like this depth meter and also micrometer for measuring essentially the shims. And the way how we are going to do this is basically summarized in this table. So here I have a sketch of our case and the top plate and the bearing that is basically protruding out from the case into the plate. We will need to do a couple of measurements. First, we will need to, I already measured plate thickness, and all measurements here are in millimeters, so plate is 19.05 millimeters, and it's perfectly flat, so wherever I measure it is the same value. Then next, what I am going to measure is plate to bearing distance, so essentially from here to the bearing. And then when I have that distance, by knowing plate thickness, it's easy to calculate what's the bearing height. So when I have my bearing height, I can actually also measure what's the cover depth and then subtract bearing height from a cover depth, and that gives me the gap that I have from a bearing all the way to the cover. And that gap actually needs to accommodate my shim. If I have oil baffle, it needs to accommodate an end plate, which is 0.10 millimeters. So by measuring these several metrics, I can actually calculate what the shim needs to be. And I have 3 different tables for intermediate shaft, input shaft and output shaft, and then I'll proceed with the measurements. Only intermediate shaft has an oil baffle, and I already measured this one. Nominally this is 0.5 millimeter, but when I measured it, it was 0.54. It varied between 0.53 and 0.55 on like several different locations, and the average value was 0.54. Same thing, this measurement between plate to bearing, that distance, we will measure it at 4 different locations, and then we will use average value, and similar for a cover depth. Okay. So first one to start with in our table is intermediate shaft, so plate to bearing distance. I already zeroed my depth meter to this plate. So if we check it, it's a perfect 0. And now I can essentially do 4 measurements of this bearing with respect to this top surface of a plate. Okay, and measurements will be done at 3, 6, 9 and 12 o'clock. Okay, so this is 4.76. And then 4.76. Four point 4.80. $4.79. And finally, $4.78. Okay, let's check this one more time. Okay, 4.78 is this one as well. Yep, 4.78. Okay. That's good. Now we can move to the input shaft and measure the same thing. Okay, 4.57. 57. This one. $4.59. $4.61. and 4.59. Okay, finally we are going to do output shaft. This is 4.88. Okay. Another 4.88. Another 4.88. Okay, 4.85. 4.85. Okay. With that, we are done of measuring distance between plate and bearings, and now we will do similar thing to the cover. Okay, so I have cover in Weiss in a soft jaws. That is the easiest way to do it for me. And now we will basically do the same thing. So measure from this edge all the way down where shimming is going to be. Okay. So this is our intermediate, this is input, and this is output shaft. Let's first start with intermediate shaft. Also 4 locations as we did before. Okay, this is 15.72. 15.72. Okay. 15.71. $15.69. $15.70. Okay, now we can proceed with the input shaft. 15.12. Fifteen point 22. Fifteen point 13. 15.17. Now I'll measure one more, the second one, which is kind of too large. .19. And now we can do the output. $15.27. $15.31. Again, 15.31. And 15.27. Okay, so we have all our measurements, and now we can proceed with calculation. So first we will do intermediate. Bearing height. So what do we have? Plate thickness minus plate to bearing distance. Okay, that's our 19.05 minus 4.7875. That's 14.2625. Okay, now gap is cover depth, and that's 15.705 minus bearing height, which we just calculated, 14.2625. and that's 1.4425. Okay, and now our shim is that number minus oil baffle 0.54 minus 0.1. And that's 0.8025. Okay. Input. Bearing height, again plate thickness 1005 minus plate to bearing distance 4.59 comes to 1446. Now gap is cover depth, that's this one, 15.1525 minus bearing height 14.46, it's 0.6925. And now my shim is that number. We don't have oil baffle in input shaft, so minus 0.1, and that's 0.5925 millimeters. And finally, the output shaft. Okay, bearing height goes plate thickness again, 1905 minus plate to bearing, and that's 4.8725, 14.1775. Now the gap is cover depth 15.29 minus bearing height, which is 14.1775, and that's 1.1125 millimeters. And finally shim is that number minus, again we don't have baffle here, so 0.1 minus 0.1 brings us to 1.0125 millimeters. Okay, that's our calculation. We will need to find these three thicknesses. Probably this one will be 0.8, this one 0.6, and this one 1 millimeter. And I'll do another check of my calculations, measure the shims, and we should be back with the final assembly. Okay, so I reviewed all calculation and measurements and everything seems correct, and now we can actually proceed with putting the cover back on. So I'm again going to heat it up in the oven on 275 degrees for 5 minutes, and then whenever it's back I'll put it on top of the gearbox. So stay tuned. So while cover is heating up, we can double check the shims, and then we are also going to put some grease on top of it. Okay, so first we have intermediate shaft 0.8025. So if I measure this, this is 0.8 that I'm getting. Again 0.8, 0.805, .8. Okay, so that's intermediate. Then for the input shaft it's 0.5925, so around 0.6 would be good enough. And that's what we have here. .6. Okay. And finally for output shaft we have 1.01, so essentially 1 millimeter, and that is what we are getting, 101, 10, 101. Okay. Now what we are going to do next is we are going to put some grease on shims and this oil baffle, so it just does not move as we are putting the cover on. Okay. Any kind of bearing grease would work, it needs to be sticky enough. Okay, that will keep them in place. And now it's time to check cover. Okay, cover is now all ready, and we are just going to insert it. Okay, that's it. Okay. Now we are going to use new washers. That's it. Okay, so while everything is still kind of warm, I'm going to drive in the output shaft seal. Okay. First I want to start it by hand. Okay. And then I will use this driver. Okay. Okay, so we will torque that. Okay. And we need to put seal here. That looks terrific. And now whenever you are completely done, just do a couple of taps on the shafts so you know that everything is properly seated. That's it. Okay, we can proceed with torquing this nut. 155 is what I'm going to use. Okay. this. So now we are going to put some remaining parts, like gear lever. I already changed the rubber, which was pretty well used, so it's getting new one. We will just put a tiny bit of grease here. Okay. At the same time, we can also put a new neutral position switch and a gasket. Okay. Now we can actually check the transmission. Okay, it's in neutral. Okay, that's second gear. That's third. Fourth. Fifth gear. Okay. Now I can go down. Fourth, third, second, neutral, and then first one is always the hardest one. Okay. And the first gear. Alright, so it seems everything is working. Neutral, that's perfect. Now what we are going to do is we will check this neutral switch. When in this one is normally short circuit when in neutral. So now gearbox is in neutral. Okay. Okay. This is second gear. Now let's check it. Okay, perfect. It works. Awesome. Okay, now we are just going to tighten it, but we need to be very careful with these because they are notorious for breaking. So very gentle. Okay, it should be enough. Okay. And now we can actually proceed with putting plugs. Okay, we I will torque this one. Filler plug. And this is hollow bolt for speedo cable, and it's also used for as a breather of the gearbox. Okay. With that, we are done with this gearbox. We will put clutch rod once when we install it on a bike. But that concludes this video.